Just when it seemed the tension had reached its peak, another twist hit. One of the officers, clearly trying to make sense of Karen's wild accusation, asked my wife for a second form of identification to confirm everything. It wasn't a hostile request, more like procedure, but the shift in tone made the crowd lean in even closer. Karen smirked, convinced she had finally cornered her. For a brief moment, it felt like the balance of power was teetering back in her favor. My wife, calmly, reached into her bag, but before she could hand over anything, another voice cut through the air. A neighbor from our old HOA, someone who had also clashed with Karen in the past, stepped forward. They had seen everything unfold and couldn't stay silent anymore. They spoke up about Karen's history of false reports, her habit of dragging neighbors into unnecessary drama, and how she had even tried to fine them for things that were never against HOA rules. Suddenly, this wasn't just Karen versus my wife, was Karen versus the truth that had been bubbling beneath the surface for years. The officer's expressions shifted again, but the tension didn't break, it only escalated. Karen's face went pale, then red, as she tried to shout over the neighbor's words, insisting none of it mattered. But with every denial, her voice cracked just a little more. You could sense she was losing control, yet refusing to back down. Now, the stakes were higher than ever. My wife's honor was on the line. The officer's patience was running thin. Tay's credibility was crumbling right before everyone's eyes. And in that charged silence, it became clear what happened next would decide who truly walked away with their reputation intact. The officers finally stepped forward, their patience clearly gone. One of them asked my wife directly if she had any doubt about showing her credentials, and without hesitation, she handed over her wallet. Inside, along with her military ID, were her driver's license and a few other forms of ID, all lining up perfectly. The officer glanced at them, nodded respectfully, and handed them back. In that instant, the entire weight of Karen's accusations collapsed. The smugness she had carried from the start vanished, replaced by an expression of sheer disbelief, but the twist wasn't over yet. The officer turned to Karen and, in front of the small crowd that had gathered, calmly explained that filing false reports and wasting police time was itself a serious matter. That one sentence sent a ripple through the neighbors watching, many of whom had been silent victims of Karen's behavior for years. Her face froze, caught between rage and fear, as the reality of her own actions came crashing down. And then came the final blow. The neighbor who had stepped in earlier revealed they had been quietly recording the entire exchange from the moment the cops arrived. Every accusation, every false claim, every desperate attempt was all on video. Karen's jaw dropped, and for the first time, she had nothing to say. The officers didn't arrest her, but the warning was firm and public. She was told that if she ever pulled something like this again, there would be real consequences. The crowd dispersed, but the look on Karen's face lingered. She had tried to strip my wife of her dignity, only to lose her own in front of everyone. And that twist, a moment her own tactics turned against her, was the true end of her control. After the officers left and the small crowd slowly drifted back to their homes, a strange calm settled over the street. My wife and I stood there, still processing everything that had just unfolded. What started as another attempt by an HOA Karen to control someone's life had turned into a public lesson about respect and boundaries. My wife had handled the situation with the same quiet strength she carried in every part of her life, and seeing her stand tall through it reminded me why I admired her so deeply. In the days that followed, word spread quickly through both neighborhoods. Old neighbors who had stayed silent for too long suddenly began to share their own stories more openly. For many, that one confrontation gave them the courage to push back against the unreasonable demands that had weighed them down for years. It was like the grip Karen once had over the community had cracked, and people weren't afraid to speak out anymore. As for Karen, she kept her distance after that day. The embarrassment of being exposed in front of the police and the neighbors seemed to take the fight out of her. There were no more calls, no more confrontations. Just silence, a silence that felt like long overdue peace. Looking back, the whole ordeal taught us something important. Freedom from an HOA isn't just about moving away. It's about refusing to let fear or control follow you. My wife's military ID may have stopped Karen in her tracks, but it was her dignity, patience, and strength that truly ended the fight. And in the end, that was the victory that mattered most. It started out like any other quiet morning, but little did we know it would turn into one of the most unbelievable HOA stories we had ever lived through. My wife had just moved out of our old neighborhood, controlled by one of the most power-hungry HOA boards you could imagine. She was relieved to finally be free from all the rules, the constant nitpicking, and especially from the woman we all knew as the HOA Karen. This woman had a reputation for meddling in everyone's business. But what happened next shocked even us. Not long after my wife left the HOA community, Karen spotted her at our new place and immediately jumped to wild conclusions. Without asking a single question, she decided to call the cops, convinced that my wife was somehow breaking rules that no longer even applied to her. Imagine that, reporting someone to the police just for moving out of an HOA. It was outrageous, but also strangely typical of the way Karen handled things. The officers showed up, ready to hear both sides, and Karen stood there, smugly certain. She had caught my wife red-handed. But what she didn't know was that my wife carried something that would change the entire tone of the situation. The moment she pulled out her military ID, the smugness drained right off Karen's face. It was a turning point none of us could have predicted, and it left everyone standing there in silence, wondering what would happen next, and that's where the story truly begins. Because what followed turned a simple HOA dispute into something much bigger. To really understand how we ended up in that bizarre moment, you have to know the history. Between my wife and the HOA, for years, she had dealt with endless complaints and letters about the most ridiculous things. The HOA Karens seemed to have her on a personal watch list, criticizing her garden, questioning her parking, even calling out the color of a small decoration on our porch. My wife never wanted conflict, but every time she tried to comply, another rule popped up. It felt less like community living and more like living under constant surveillance. When she finally decided to move out of that HOA neighborhood, it was supposed to be a fresh start. No more nitpicking, no more power games. We both thought leaving would end the constant tension. But clearly, Karen wasn't ready to let go. It was as if she needed to keep control, even over people who were no longer her neighbors. Calling the cops after spotting my wife outside our new home was just the latest move in a long pattern of overreach. The strange part was how quickly the situation escalated. The officers arrived calm and professional, but you could see on their faces they were confused as to why they had even been called. Karen, on the other hand, acted like she had uncovered some kind of crime. She kept pointing, talking fast, making it sound like my wife was trespassing or violating rules that didn't apply anymore. But the moment my wife showed her military ID, everything shifted. The officer's eyes told a story of respect, while Karen's expression froze in disbelief. And yet, that silence wasn't the end, was only the beginning of a much bigger clash. The air felt heavy after that moment. The cops glanced at Karen, then back at my wife, clearly unsure why they were standing in the middle of what was supposed to be a simple neighborhood. My wife stayed calm, holding her ground with quiet confidence, but Karen's voice grew sharper. As she scrambled to justify herself, she started insisting that even though my wife had moved away, she was still connected to the HOA somehow, as if the rules stretched beyond the property lines. The logic didn't make sense, but that never stopped her before. One of the officers politely asked Karen to explain exactly what law she thought had been broken. For a second, you could see the panic behind her eyes. She hesitated, then muttered about community safety and keeping order, but the words sounded hollow. The truth was, Karen wasn't protecting anyone she just couldn't handle. The idea that she no longer had power over someone she used to control. That wasn't the only layer to this story, though. Some of our old neighbors had quietly reached out after we left, sharing how Karen had made their lives just as miserable. She filed complaints over kids playing too loudly, accused one family of not mowing their lawn to regulation height, and even tried to fine another for hanging holiday lights too early. It was a pattern control dressed up as rules. Standing there with the cops, my wife realized she wasn't just facing one false accusation. She was facing years of pent-up resentment that Karen couldn't let go of. And while the officers held back their judgment, the tension kept climbing. Because the next word spoken would determine whether this ended quietly or exploded into something no one saw coming. Karen's face grew tighter with every second of silence. You could almost see the gears turning as she tried to twist the situation back in her favor. She began raising her voice, waving her hands, claiming my wife was a danger to the community and demanding the officers do something. The cops, clearly uncomfortable, shifted their weight and exchanged quick glances, but they still hadn't stepped in fully. It was as if they were waiting to see just how far this would go. My wife didn't flinch. She simply stood there, calm but unyielding, her military ID still in her hand like a shield. That calmness seemed to irritate Karen even more. Her tone changed from loud to almost desperate, as if she realized she was losing control of the narrative she had built. And that was when she made her boldest move yet, trying to accuse my wife of impersonating military personnel. Right there in front of the officers, the tension spiked instantly. The cops froze, and so did I. It was a reckless claim, one that could spiral out of control in seconds if the officers didn't see through it. You could feel the air-shift neighbors were starting to peek from behind their windows and porches, watching everything unfold. What had started as a petty HOA call had now drawn a quiet audience, and Karen seemed fueled by it, almost as if she thought their eyes would back her up. But in that moment, it wasn't just about HOA rules anymore. It had become a direct challenge to my wife's integrity, her service, and her dignity. And as the tension built to its highest point, everyone was waiting for the officer's next move, knowing that whatever happened next would change the course of the entire confrontation.